Hey there, Jacob Wimpstead here with C.w. Architects in Nashville, and in today's video we're talking about how architects think about architectural design. If you're a contractor and you're curious what the heck your architect's talking about half the time, or maybe you're a homeowner and you're interested to know about the design thinking, well, you've come to the right spot. I'm going to share with you how we talk about defining space, how we think about defining space, how we think about architectural hierarchy, what it is, what it means to have directionality. All those things sound fancy, but they're pretty straightforward, and I'm going to share some diagrams that help you think through that. So with that said, let's jump right into it. Okay, so I'm in the Rhino model now, and I'm just going to share with you some of these diagrams. Again, this is all fundamental architectural thinking. So this is one part of a mini-part video series I'm going to put together, so stay tuned for more of this. But this type of thinking is really applicable to all types of architecture and could be applicable to most design thinking, including like interior design. But essentially what we're going to talk about here is the the fundamentals of defining space, and we're also going to talk about the fundamentals of architectural hierarchy. So the first thing I want to share with you is the fundamentals of defining space, what spatial definition is, and we'll even get into some of what directionality is. This first diagram that I have here is just a simple wall, and of course, with a wall, you can define the difference between two different spaces. So in this case, of course, we're defining the difference between a space A and a space B. Now, if you create an opening in that wall, you can of course create a connection. Now, if it is a door, it is a physical connection, and if it's a window, it's a visual connection. Now, if the door has glass on it, you of course create a physical and a visual connection between space A and space B. And then depending on the size of the opening, you will create stronger connections. So if I zoom out to the scale of kind of an entire room, you can see here I've got a three-sided shape, three sides are actually walls. And because this one side is completely open, it creates this focus towards space B. Now, this of course is a very strong connection because the opening is so large, but the directionality part of this is that focus on space B. So if you can imagine space A as being maybe an entryway, if you walk into the entryway, you're immediately focusing on space B, and that is what we're calling directionality. It is taking your attention and focusing it towards a specific area. Now, there are other forms of directionality that are related to the exterior of the building. We'll get into that in a later video, but for now, just know that directionality, when we talk about directionality, we're talking about the direction that you focus as a viewer. A lot of what architecture is about experience. So it's not only about the aesthetics, it's not only about the layout and the function, it's really about what you experience as the occupant, as the user. And I'm, of course, a modern architect that specializes on doing residential projects, so I am more focused on what homeowners are going to experience. Whether it be a development project where I'm actually designing for the end user in mind, even though I'm working for a developer, I'm still thinking about the people that are going to be occupying and using the space, the people that are going to be living in the space. So it's important to know that when we talk about directionality, when we talk about these connections between spaces, we're really talking about the experience that the user, the occupant, is ultimately going to have. Again, we are creating a focus towards space B in this example, and that is because of this large opening and this very strong connection, and then also the three sides of walls that are completely disconnecting from the adjacent. So if I add a third space in here, space C, you can clearly see that space A is completely ignoring space C and focusing on space B. Now, the reason why this is important is because this has all sorts of uses. So this, of course, is just at the scale of a room or a series of rooms. But if we think about an entire house, we can apply the same logic. So in this example, you have a space A, which is in this case considered a living space. You have a yard space and you have a garage space, which is indicated as car. Now, of course, you need a large opening for the vehicle to be able to pull into the garage, and that creates a strong connection to the driveway. Now, what you can do is you can use the garage to actually create a disconnect between the neighbor and the yard. Now, using this, in this case, we are not only creating privacy from the yard, but we're also allowing ourselves to create stronger connections to the yard from the living space. This is because we have this privacy. We now don't have to worry about creating privacy between living space and neighbor because we have the garage that's kind of tucking the living space back and tucking the yard back with this L-shaped configuration. Now, you may not know this, but another way to define space is actually with texture. Now, a lot of times you'll see this when it comes to like a rug, for example. Putting a rug under a dining room table, it defines space. Same idea. We're creating space, or we're defining space by changing the finish of the space or changing the finish of the floor. Now, if we think about space A being this large, open, expansive space, space B can be defined with this texture, or like I said, it could be a rug, as simple as putting a rug under a dining table. So another way to define space is with a ceiling or a covering. In this diagram, you can see that space A is this large open space, and much like the texture example, you can create a ceiling plane or a covering that starts to identify a different space, a space within a space. Where this could become useful is, say, a dining room. So the same example that we were talking about before with a rug, you can start to do the same thing on the ceiling plane. Now, what this ceiling plane is starting to do is it's starting to create this more intimate space that is more divided and less open, like the large open space. So if you just think about, if you have this large living, dining, kitchen, and let's say it's got 12 or taller, 12-foot ceilings or taller in it, you can create a more intimate space, something that is more to the scale of a human being, by just simply dropping the ceiling plane and defining where that dining room goes. It's a pretty common feature in a lot of architecture, and we use this all the time. If we start to combine things like the texture and the ceiling plane, we can of course start to define that space have an even stronger definition of space. If we think about directionality and the way that walls can start to identify space, in this example we have a dual directionality that starts to give focus to two sides of this particular area. And then you can start to use things like a fireplace to create a focal point. This, of course, starts to help define space, much like a wall does. And then all of this stuff together can even start to clue you in as you're walking through this open space, where you can walk, where the dining space is, and where this invisible hallway kind of is. Okay, so let's talk about architectural hierarchy. Now, again, that sounds fancy, but it's really straightforward. All we're saying here with architectural hierarchy is what spaces are more important than others. Typically in architecture, we like to communicate things to the observer. So the person that's walking up to the building, we want to try to make it clear what types of things are happening inside the building, where to enter the building. There's all sorts of things that we can communicate in architecture to help guide folks to create an experience. So when we're talking about hierarchy, we're really just talking about what spaces are more important than others and how to communicate which spaces are more important than others. So if we look at this diagram here, it is a very simple box. There's no definition of space. There's no hierarchy whatsoever. It's all the same. So regardless of what's happening on the inside of the building, it all looks the same and there's no uniqueness to it. Now, if we start to extrude a center volume, in this case up, or even start to extrude it up and outwards, by creating this bigger volume, we're automatically starting to communicate that this center space in this particular example is more important than the side spaces or the wings of the building. So this is used all the time in modern architecture and traditional architecture. It's a very common practice, and we use this all the time. And it doesn't have to be centered like this one is. It could be off to the edge. It could be off in the back. There's all sorts of places that this kind of volume can be extruded upwards. If you've been following my series about the yard house, you can see with that one that it's got this kind of C-shaped configuration on the right side of the building where the living, dining, kitchen space is, communicating to the person out at the street that this part of the building is more important than that part of the building. Same thing here. We're extruding this volume upward and outward to create a bigger three-dimensional quality to it, or a better three-dimensional quality to it in terms of an aesthetic approach. But from a hierarchical approach, we're really just simply communicating what space is more important than another. So another way to instill architectural hierarchy is with an axis. So let me just move this plane out of the way, but you could see that I've placed this entry in the dead center of this large central volume. So because this doorway is placed in the center of not only the whole building, but placed in the center of the large volume of the central portion of the building, it's automatically communicating to the person walking up to it that this is where you enter the building, this is a very important spot, this is where I need to go. Architectural elements are not the only things that communicate hierarchy, especially when it comes to creating axial hierarchy. You can also use things like trees, shrubbery, garden walls. You can use different textures on the ground plane. If you can imagine maybe a sidewalk coming up through the center of this. Anything that's kind of axial or that's reinforcing that axial relationship, all can start to instill greater moments of hierarchy in a piece of architecture. So I'm a modern architect, and in modern architecture, a lot of it is about not only creating an experience for a user, but also removing arbitrary decisions from the design process. So I'm going to want, because this space is larger in the middle, I'm going to want to put the major space in the middle of the building where the larger volume is. Now, if this is a house, a major space is going to be like a living, dining, kitchen or a primary bedroom. A major space is really the space that is absolutely fundamental to the architectural program or the architectural function. So a major space in, let's say, a restaurant might be the dining area versus the kitchen. So the kitchen is a support space, a minor space that supports the dining space. The dining space is more important because that's where the folks are, that's where they're eating, that's where the experience of the restaurant is. So in this case, we want to put the major space in the middle. Like I said before, we're creating this architectural hierarchy that's highlighting this really important space. So if this were a house, again, living, dining, kitchen would go in the large space, and then the minor spaces would be like a laundry room or a garage, or maybe it's the guest bedrooms. All the stuff that's not really fundamental to the living in the house really goes in the minor space, typically. And that's typically the language that a lot of architects tend to follow and focus on. Now, again, architecture is about not only the aesthetics, it's not only about the layout and the function of the building, it's also about the user experience. So if we just expand on this example a little further, you can enter into the building, you know where the major space is, you know it has the hierarchy, and let's say there's a view beyond this. Let's say in the backyard, if this was a house, there's this large expansive view. You can automatically start to align the view, the axial relationships, all up together. That way the user experience has this directionality towards that view and automatically starts to instill this certain level of importance in the layout, in the architecture, in the fundamentals of the entire design. Okay, so let's see this in action. Let's see an example of hierarchy and of spatial definition. So what you're looking at here is the yard house. That's been a primary subject of my videos, a lot of my videos in the past, and I'm continuing my series on the yard house. But let's just take a look at some of the elements specifically on this design that are related to hierarchy and spatial definition. So the first thing I want to point out is just the overall look of this particular design. You can see that there are tall elements and there are shorter elements. Now, if we look at it just kind of a front-on view, this is kind of from the street as you walk up to the building. You can notice right off the bat this kind of C shape. Again, that is the most important part of this design of this building. That particular part of the design is where the living, dining, kitchen is. It's where the important outdoor spaces are. That really is the primary focal point of the architecture. It's communicating that this is where you enter the home, this is where the primary living space is, these are the connections to the context. That is the most important spot. Now, you can also see in the background this kind of secondary space. Now, that particular volume is the primary bedroom. It is her bedroom, it is the owner's walk-in closet, and her bathroom. So that volume of space is secondary, but still a very important space in the architecture. Now, the rest of this space, the lower space, is all support spaces. There is a garage in there, there's a laundry room, there's a place for her dog, there's a pantry, all the stuff that's kind of supporting the primary bedroom and the living, dining, kitchen portion of the house are these kind of lower, less important elements. So right off the bat, you can see that that is instilling hierarchy in this particular design. Now, in terms of spatial definition, on the exterior, we have these series of walls and planes that are at different heights that are really starting to create elements of privacy and disconnect. So where there is more privacy concerns, we're going to create taller walls, more solidity in the building. That's creating a spatial separation and reducing the connections because we've reduced the windows. Now, we will get into material choices and stuff like that in later videos, but just know that the material selection of those elements is really important as well. Why use brick? Why use this solid kind of masonry element on these private things versus something that's lighter, more transparent? So material is also a quality that's really important for defining space. But in this example, you can see that I've created a series of walls that starts to create layers between the street and the driveway and the actual house itself. The idea here is that as you pass through these layers, you are entering into this more private space. So if you're up on the front porch, you have entered her domain. You've entered this owner's domain. If you're out in the driveway, you've started to enter it. So as you get closer to the house, you're passing through these layers of walls that start to bring you into her space, her private space. So that's a really big, important part of spatial definition. Now, like in the previous example that I showed earlier, the diagram, this does have, that diagram was taken from this building. So her living space has this really strong connection to this outdoor space and the yard, but at the same time, the garage and the primary bedroom wing of the house are actually blocking the neighbor from actually seeing her yard, her private space. So, and then you can also see in here, in terms of spatial definition, there are no elements, there's no windows on this side of the building on her bedroom because we want to create that privacy. We want to create that separation. So the positioning of the windows and the walls, all that stuff is very intentional to create this user experience and to create something truly custom to not only her lifestyle, but it was also important to the site, the context where this design was actually being placed. Okay, so that just barely scratches the surface of the fundamental design thinking for architecture. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, I'm going to keep putting together videos that talk about those fundamentals, talk about design thinking to help you through your next project. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you haven't done so already, also go check out our blog page. We cover this kind of stuff and even more. We cover things like the construction technology, materials, the process of the design. All those things are on our blog page already, so go and check that out, and I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you on the next video.